Welcome. We're going to talk about our cannabis portfolio today. I'm here with Mike Rarey. Hi, Mike.
Hello.
It was quite a year for our cannabis portfolio. Started off on quite a high, no pun intended, and experienced some pretty significant withdrawal symptoms throughout the year and had ended up in a fairly bad place relative to where we started the year.
Very sober place.
Very sober place. And Mike, we're going to walk through the year, take us through sort of an overview of what happened, and then we'll talk about the changes we're going to make to the portfolio.
Yeah. Coming into the year, pot stocks were rallying very strongly. You had the U.S. Farm Bill passed late in 2018, and so hemp became legal, so that was a big move. We already had the Canadian rollout, and then the most important factor was all equities just melted down in Q4 and came skyrocketing back up starting in January. So for the first 4 months of the year, the portfolio was up about 62%. Important to keep in mind, this is the type of portfolio that in 4 months can be up 62%.
Right, quite a high.
Yes. And then ran into a various number of industry-specific and stock-specific issues in the final 8 months of the year to be down 62% during that time period. And how the compounding actually works, up 62, then down 62, it nets out to being down 40% for the whole year. And that math does check out. It doesn't seem like it would, but
unfortunately.
But that was the overall experience. So very difficult year.
Okay. So give us some of the highlights from what caused the downtrend during the year.
Yeah. Some of the early issues that were happening in the year were the very delayed rollout in Canada of Cannabis 2.0. So currently in Canada, the only products that were able to be sold were just very basic products like the flower, like some oils. And then the Cannabis 2.0 rollout is where a lot of the big Canadian cultivators and growers are going to be able to start selling higher margin products, much higher margin products, things like THC vaping cartridges, edibles, lotions, all those types of things.
Right.
So a big delay in that. And what we really saw were governments, in the provincial governments in Canada, and then also governments in the US where it was legalized on a state level, really bottlenecking supply. And you had this situation where demand was there and the supply was there. But there's the government in the middle, really messing it up and making sure these two things don't meet.
So unusual.
Yeah, right. And what ended up happening was a lot of these companies produced the product and got it out there, and it just never got to consumers, and they had to write down a lot of their inventory. So then you started to see a lot of revenue warnings. And that's when the negative momentum really started to pick up. Other issues we ran into were because of the taxes that a lot of the provincial governments in Canada were slapping on to cannabis-related products. And then in the US, some of the taxes associated with buying legally. What ended up happening is you got a large price spread between legal being more expensive for the consumer and then black market being cheaper. And a lot of folks were very comfortable and had a lot of experience buying black market cannabis, and they're price sensitive buyers. And so they just stayed in the black market. So you had a lower than expected migration from black market to legal channels. That also resulted in some revenue warnings from some of the big companies. Things like that. And then other big issues, we had a very sudden rise in vaping related lung injuries and deaths. And a lot of the future growth prospects of cannabis companies hinge upon the popularity of vaping and THC vaping cartridges being sort of the future and the higher margin products. And so when you saw a sudden rise in vaping related injuries and deaths, a lot of governments in the US, we reacted very strongly. In Alberta, for example, they just outlawed THC cartridges for a limited period of time until we got our arms around it. We don't know why this is happening, but it needs to stop. So that was a surprising sudden source of demand drying up. And thankfully the CDC conducted a study on what was actually happening and found it was THC cartridges purchased from China in the black market that had a vitamin E acetate in them that was very harmful. So it had nothing to do with the actual products, the legal products that were being sold. So we had that as well.
Okay. So give us an overview of where marijuana legalization stands in the U.S.
Yeah.
And what we expect it to evolve to in 2020.
So we're at the point where either recreationally and or medically, cannabis is legal in 33 states. And then it's expected to be on the ballot this fall in another 16 states.
Okay.
So you're at the point where on a state-by-state basis, it's almost legal everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So getting to that point, a bill has been drafted in a congressional committee for federal legalization. Obviously, it has not come to vote. You probably won't see it this fall. And a lot of polls suggest that the majority of voters would be in favor of federal legalization, about 2/3.
Okay.
And then about 3/4 of millennials would be in favor of federal legalization. So a lot of momentum pushing towards federal legalization,
Okay.
for sure.
Okay. What else on the outlook side do we think is going to impact these stocks, in particular in the industry overall?
Quite a few things. One, the biggest thing is just understanding the size of these markets. The cannabis market in the US is estimated right now, illicit and legal, to be right around 80 billion. That's about the size of the beer market, but it's expected to grow by 20% annually. So that's a very attractive opportunity, especially when you think what's the combined market capitalization of the US multi-state operators. It's somewhere in the ballpark of 12 billion. So you have 12 billion in market cap, an $80 billion industry expected to grow at 20%. You just have to understand we're in the very early innings of this. This is a long-term investment thesis, but the opportunity is huge. The government needs to get out of the way. A lot of the industry has to mature. We need thoughtful regulation. In a way, a lot of these issues that came up throughout the year are great for the industry in the long term. A lot of research is being done by the FDA on the long-term effects of things like CBD and cannabis. And as that happens, it will allow these cannabis companies to really differentiate themselves, because the consumer wants a consistent experience. They want brand loyalty. They want all these things, and regulation is going to bring that over the long term. It just hurts when it starts out, right? But it is good long term. So we're definitely seeing a lot of that.
And how much of the market is illegal versus legitimate?
It varies a lot state by state, and in Canada, depending on the rollout. So there are estimates that in Canada it's somewhere around 50-50. But for example, in California, it's more like 80% is still black market. And the key thing is, as state by state, as we get more and more rollouts, each state is getting a little smarter about how they're doing it, about the number of licenses they're putting out there, and about how they're going to crack down on black market sales. Because once it becomes legal on the state level, the state now has a financial incentive from a tax revenue standpoint to make sure as much of the cannabis sold in the state is through legal means. And they have the wherewithal. They're collecting tax revenue that they can use to then pay for cracking down on illegal sales. So still a lot of black market sales, but we think as the industry matures, that will definitely go down.
But perhaps as wide of a gap as there could be black market to legal right now.
Yeah, you would think the widest gap you're going to get is very early in the legalization process. So it should narrow over time.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about the portfolio, some of the holdings, and some of the changes we're going to make. We can start with our current holdings in the portfolio and how we're evolving them going forward.
To date, the portfolio has basically consisted of, they're known as the Big Five, but we include Hexo in there, so Big Six. And it's basically the very large Canadian cultivators and growers. And the reason why, focusing on these stocks, they were the companies that received a large portion of the big influx of capital into the industry from retail investors, and then also have established themselves with joint ventures and received investments from large multinational corporations. So things like a Canopy Growth, Constellation Brands owns right around 37% of Canopy. Kronos, Altria has a large stake in Kronos. Hexo has a joint venture with Molson Coors. So those have been the companies to date. And I mean, they were beaten down last year, but now they're at the point where their stock prices are basically the most attractive they've been since 2017, trading at anywhere from a 20 to 150% discount to sell-side consensus analyst estimates right now, and an even larger discount to their 52-week highs. And obviously, you know, the industry has had a lot of headwinds, but throughout that, these companies are generating gross margins of over 30%, and revenue growth of anywhere from 100 to 300%. So, you know, that helps you sort of look through these near-term issues when you see numbers like that, you know.
What about how we're evolving the portfolio and new opportunities that we're looking to expand into?
So the new opportunities we're looking to get into, one, diversifying into the large best-in-class U.S. multi-state operators. A couple of reasons. One, the U.S. market is far larger than the Canadian market, and the Canadian cultivators and growers that currently own can't really sell into the U.S. market. So we don't have a lot of exposure today. We have indirect exposure. Canopy has an agreement to acquire acreage holdings if cannabis gets legalized federally, but that's it. So adding 3 of the best-in-class U.S. multi-state operators, Cureleaf, Green Thumb, and Cresco Labs, gives us a lot of great exposure to the U.S. market as more and more states legalize. Additionally, these companies already have medicinal licenses in a lot of states where recreational legalization is potentially going to be on the ballot. So they have a first mover advantage. What we've seen is the companies that have medicinal license in a state, when recreational becomes legal, they are able to sell recreational the day of legalization. And that's a huge advantage compared to going through the whole application process. So that, and then the other stock that we're adding to the portfolio is GW Pharmaceuticals. This one is far less about the getting high and more about the getting well. Basically, this company is the first company to have an FDA-approved cannabis-based treatment. Went through the entire clinical trial process and basically have a very synthesized, a very purified form of CBD oil that is approved for the treatment of certain types of early childhood epilepsy. They also have other cannabis-based drugs that have been approved for other illnesses outside of the U.S. that are currently going through the clinical trial process. So a very legitimate company that has earnings, has revenues, have products that currently work and serve a need, and they're on the cutting edge of understanding the endocannabinoid system and how cannabis-based drugs can be an alternative to other drugs that maybe have some bad side effects that people are currently using.
So as we wrap this up, give our investors and listeners an idea of what we expect going forward and the time horizon of this type of investment.
So very much in the early innings of this industry, in the early innings of legalization. And when you take that type of a perspective and if you still believe in the long-term thesis is intact, which we certainly do, then you look at what's happened over the past year and a half, and you think, it's rare you get another opportunity to buy at these prices. I mean, if you got in super early, you were buying at these prices. It's rare that you get it now where the fundamentals, if anything, have improved. We're so much closer to federal legalization and more of these high margin products coming out. So we think it's a really great opportunity, and just understanding, there's a tremendous amount of volatility. Invest, don't look at it. We'll continue to do the research and pick out the winners.
Don't
overreact.
Yes. Volatility will be here in the early innings.
Right.
Great. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.